Hello, I'm Juliet Antonio.
I'm Aaron Isaac.
And welcome to the second episode of Where's the Director? Because we would like to have a word with them. Aaron, thanks for coming back for episode 2. Much appreciated.
Pleasure.
All right. So, for our second episode, we are going to be talking about Les Miserables. So, let's dive into the background. Les Miserables, affectionately nicknamed Les Mis, is a musical with lyrics by Alain Boublil and Jean-Marc Nattel, music by Claude-Michel Schoenberg, and translated into English by Herbert Kretzmer and James Fenton. Set in the early 19th century of France, convict Jean Valjean is released from prison after 19 years for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his sister and her dying son, which, listening to that, you're thinking, that's disproportionate to the crime, but Valjean's arrest, if you do the math, was in 1796 when the French Revolution was still raging. Desiring redemption, he decides to break his parole after a bishop shows him an act of mercy, but Police Inspector Javert refuses to let him escape justice and pursues him. As time passes, we see Valjean exhibiting acts of kindness towards others, and this eventually leads to him and a slew of characters being caught up in the June 1832 rebellion in Paris, which was a failed anti-monarchist insurrection led by Parisian Republicans, most of whom were students. Now, the musical itself is based on the original French novel by Victor Hugo, which was published in 1862 and clocks in at 1,462 pages unabridged. Yes, this lengthy page count can be attributed to over 25% of the book being dedicated to Hugo's lengthy descriptions of French history and the architecture and urban design of Paris and its sewer systems, with no advancement of plot or even the subplots. The novel also addresses politics, moral philosophy, anti-monarchism, justice, religion, and types of love ranging from romantic to familial. While the book received negative reviews in its day for immorality, being overly sentimental, and expressing sympathy for the revolutionaries, today it is considered to be one of the greatest novels of the 19th century. As for the musical, it was originally written as a French concept album and premiered at the Palais des Sports in Paris in 1980, directed by filmmaker Robert Hossein. It is sung all the way through with recitative, which is dialogue sung in the rhythm of ordinary speech in place of spoken lines. 3 years later, producer Cameron McIntosh received the concept album and was asked to adapt the musical into English. He reluctantly agreed and assembled a team in conjunction with the Royal Shakespeare Company in London, the RSC. The artistic director, Trevor Nunn, worked with Mackintosh directing Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cats and went on to direct Les Mis when it premiered at the Barbican in London in 1985. The original London production ran from 1985 to 2019 for over 13,000 performances, making it the second longest ranked show in history after The Fantastics. It transferred to Broadway in 1987, running until 2003, winning 8 Tony Awards, including Best Musical, Best Book, and Best Score. It has since had numerous revivals, including a recent one set in modern day that actually looked really, really good, tours, concert productions, and a film adaptation in 2012, which changed movie musicals for better or for worse, depending on who you ask. For more information on the Les Mis movie, I personally highly recommend the video essay, Why the Music in the Les Mis Movie is Worse Than You Think, by Ethan from Sideways. Get ready to cry. Now, Les Mis the musical shared a similar fate to the original novel because the reviews were negative, with scholars managing to get their 2 cents in, taking the attitude of, how dare you turn a piece of classic literature into a musical? Audiences, however, raved about the show. It broke box office records, and it is now considered one of the greatest musicals of all time. So, the version of Les Mis that Aaron and I will be discussing is one of the many stage concert versions. This one is the 25th anniversary, live at the O2 Arena in London in 2010, starring Alfie Boe, Lea Salonga, Norm Lewis, Nick Jonas, Katie Hall, Samantha Barks, Matt Lucas, Jenny Galloway, Ramin Karimloo, Hadley Fraser, and Earl Carpenter. And, fun fact, stars from the original production in 1985, the 2010 London Company, international tour, and school productions all took part, creating an ensemble of 300 performers. So, Aaron, with all that backstory and facts out of the way, where would you like to start?
First of all, you'll have to explain to me why you didn't let me watch the movie.
Okay. So, I don't want to spend too much time on this. Go watch Ethan's essay. Mm-hmm. Please do. The bottom line is, what that movie musical did was, instead of what traditional movie musicals do, which is pre-recording the music, they decided to sing it live, which led to a whole host of technical problems. And Anne Hathaway said, well, I didn't want it to sound too pretty. And I said to myself, yeah, but you also need to be technically correct in your singing. You still have to follow technique and vocal dynamics. And what this basically did was, in production, when they were singing it live on set, they had a piano player playing in their ear. They weren't hearing the full orchestra. And when it came time for the orchestra to record, they had to follow the singers, all of whom didn't follow the music, took their own breaths when they felt like it, and you're just watching the musicians constantly in a state of anguish but also exhaustion. And Tom Hooper had never directed a movie musical before. You know what the next movie musical he made after this was?
No.
Cats.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So he is not qualified to make a movie musical. And what it led to was a trend in movie musicals where it's like, oh, live singing is real and authentic and raw and gritty. But in reality, it just leads to movie musicals not sounding good. And I know people are saying, well, it can't be the movie musicals of the 1950s. We're not trying to do that, but at the same time, it's just making musicals that people think are highbrow and cultured and are edgy and new, when really they don't do justice to the original, and it is just such a letdown. And you can't believe that these movies got made, because they are objectively, and I say objectively in this sense because they've been analyzed by a lot of musical theater performers and scholars, objectively awful. So that's your answer.
I got you. All right. So I see your anguish, the anguish in your face as you speak. So we'll move on.
Thank you.
So I want to talk about the overarching theme.
Okay.
Kind of the story of redemption.
Yes.
That goes on. And it's really interesting that I watched this now because for the book, I had to read Nietzsche.
I was waiting for Nietzsche to come up.
Oh, really?
Yes, because there's one character in particular, but we might get to that later, so keep going.
Okay. The reason I had to read Nietzsche more recently is because my co-author, Mitch, who is more the Nietzsche expert, had to step away for just a bit to do work stuff. So to advance the book, I was like, okay, yeah, I'll reread some Nietzsche, because I had only skimmed Nietzsche before. Reading him more intentionally actually brings up this idea of redemption, what it means to be redeemed, and I think for the most part, existentialists don't have a holistic view of redemption, which goes into, and we can talk about this later, their idea of what it means to be a human being. But Nietzsche, he has this issue with a philosopher who inspired him called Schumpeter, or is it Schopenhauer? I always get those two confused.
No worries, it's okay.
But anyway, if anyone listening is familiar with who Nietzsche is, you can tell which one. But anyway, the view that Nietzsche is taking on is the idea that a tragedy shows the true face of what it means to exist.
Ah, I agree with that.
Where Nietzsche, the view that Nietzsche is tackling is tragedy shows us that existence is, it shows us the horrible side of life, is the exact quote. Nietzsche says, well, tragedy might show us this, but that doesn't mean that life itself is such a bad thing, which would be the line of the pessimist.
Yes.
Nietzsche is anti-pessimist, anti-nihilist. His conclusion of tragedy is it reveals the inherent value of life by showing how even through tragedy, people still affirm life. And this fits into his idea of what redemption means. Nietzsche would say redemption means living your life in such a way that you would live it all again, all suffering intact.
I think Valjean would agree with that. So, with that said, can we talk about Valjean for a little bit?
Yes, it's a good transition.
Okay, great. So, when we first meet Valjean in the prologue establishes this cycle with all the characters. That is desperation, prayer, and doubt. But in the prologue, we only see this with the newer inmates. Those who've been in the prison as long as Valjean have gone through the cycle already, and it ends with them being broken down and hopeless. And the only way for them to survive is to not interact with their jailers. Now, when Valjean is released from prison on parole, he goes through the cycle again because he's entering a new world. So he enters a situation that for him is tabula rasa, and he hopes for a fresh start. And he makes a promise not to forget the years behind him, but it's so he doesn't take this new life for granted. And when he's out, he's again treated as less than for being a former convict and learns, wherever I go, the law will follow me. So when the bishop treats him kindly, when he steals the candlesticks and gets caught and says, you can take the silver, he goes through what I'm going to call a term from Brene Brown, which is foreboding joy. Because when he feels the kindness of being let into the home and eating the bishop's food, he can sense, this is going to run out, it's too good to be true. So he steals the silver and leaves so he can make money while the going is still good. Instead, the bishop uses this moment to teach him a lesson, saying to use this moment to become an honest man. And as someone who grew up Catholic, it tells you that he's very well read, and it makes sense because he knows that some of the most devout followers of Christ started out as sinners, much like Valjean, St. Augustine stole pears. And he also takes a more New Testament view of Christianity than the Old Testament theme that crops up throughout the show with one character in particular. So Valjean says it here, the only life he's known is take an eye for an eye, a reference to the famous line from Exodus. And he says, if there's another way to go, he missed it 20 years ago. And for his crime, he believed himself to be forever condemned because they took away his name and branded a number upon his chest. But in spite of all the armor that he's crafted to survive his cruel surroundings, which I can't blame him for, there is still vulnerability behind it, which is why he allowed the bishop to reach out to him. And now that he's confronted with the man society shaped him into, the nature versus nurture debate, which we'll get into again with another character, he's moved to make a change and live a better life, which shows how he is a man of character. He could have looked within himself and either bemoaned his state and done nothing, or lashed out at other people because he's so uncomfortable in his own skin that he cannot bear goodness and can only see his sins reflected in other people, like the judge in Sweeney. But instead he takes the sign as a new believer and decides to use the fresh start God has given him. And if it's okay with you, I want to talk about Who Am I a little bit. Mm-hmm. Okay, so in terms of musical theater structure, you can't call this the 11 o'clock number because it's in the middle of Act 1, but it is Valjean's decision song that will either stop the show in its tracks or keep the musical going. And we're also reminded of Valjean's promise to the bishop with the people around him, and this is the moment where he'll either make good on it or he won't. So for a bit of context, in this moment, Valjean catches up with Inspector Javert, and Javert tells him that there is a man that they have captured, whom Javert believes to be Jean Valjean, and he's going to come to court today. And Valjean kind of says, well, are you sure? What proof do you have? And Javert goes, he will bend, he will break. This time there is no mistake. So Valjean's predicament is, does he lie and let an innocent man go to jail, or does he tell the truth at the expense of the workers who look to him for their daily bread? And as soon as I heard that, I went, that's the trolley problem. Mm-hmm. Which, for those who aren't familiar, Good Place fans are very familiar. There's a trolley that's barreling on the railroad tracks. In the track in front of you, 5 people are tied up and unable to move. You can switch to a different one, but if you do, you'll hit one person who is also tied up and unable to move. So do you go straight ahead or pull the lever? There's antithesis here. Do I save him or don't I? So a lot of people take umbrage with Valjean's decision, but if you listen to the lyrics, you can see why Valjean would make this decision as a character. He knows his life is a lie, and if he keeps it up, he won't be able to live with himself. And also when he says, my soul belongs to God, I know, I made that bargain long ago, he's remembering how the kindness of one person changed his life forever. And as a man striving to be better, he can't ignore a man whose life is effectively in his hands. And there's one remark here that I wish to make. I heard a reviewer say online that by the time you get to this point in the show, halfway through Act 1, the musical starts to feel like les coïncidences, because Javert just happens to be in the same town as Valjean, and the trial of the innocent man is the day they meet again face to face. Now, with Victor Hugo's pacing in the original novel, these events are more spaced out in a way that can't be done. We're trying to write a musical that's like 2.5 hours. But I have a theory that if you are a theist like Valjean, you don't see it that way. It reminds me of a quotation of Einstein's: coincidences are God's way of remaining anonymous. So theists and Valjean see these coincidences as God stepping in and give you a choice. Set yourself on the path that is laid out for you by the universe, or walk away. And I think that with those two songs, if you put them together side by side, you really see the leap that Valjean's character has made over the years. Because again, to us, it seems like a short amount of time, maybe 30 minutes. But he has had, I think, over a decade at this point, and it just shows you how far he's come and grown.
The Who Am I song, I think, was the most existential part of this whole thing.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, insofar as existentialists are really concerned about what you have to do to make a choice. And you mentioned the trolley problem. I'd go a step further. It's even a little more complicated, because it's not between a bunch of people and one other person. It's between himself and a bunch of other people.
Ah, that's true.
And what's interesting about his thought process is he knows there's no good answer.
No, yeah.
Because if he doesn't say anything, he doesn't do it out of a selfish motivation. His motivation in the song, he says, all the workers I have will go hungry if I'm locked up.
Yeah, if I speak, they are condemned. If I stay silent, I am damned. Right.
Yeah, and then the idea of, well, just don't say anything also doesn't feel correct, because, well, for a whole bunch of reasons. But let me move on to... There is something that ties together a lot of the different existentialists over time. Between Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, all the way to Sartre, and even de Beauvoir, it's this idea that not only are you forced to make a decision, but when you get to people like Nietzsche and Sartre, you get to moral decisions which actually can't be answered objectively.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The idea is given by Sartre when he talks about his student who comes to him for advice. You may have heard of this.
I might have. I think you told it to me once, but keep going.
So, student comes to Sartre. The student says, I have a choice. I can look after my grandmother, who's very ill, and I'm the only one who can take care of her. Or I can join the resistance against the Germans. And my brother died fighting against them.
Jeez.
And he felt like not only to avenge his brother, but to fight in the resistance. Keep in mind, Sartre's era is during World War II.
Yes.
And also, Sartre was held prisoner for some amount of time. So, Sartre's big question to all of us is, what's the right answer? You know, if you think about it for a really long time, you might be able to say, well, what maxim, what moral rule wins out here?
Yeah.
And something that's common in Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Sartre, they don't like moral absolute decision making. So this comes about through an opposition to Immanuel Kant.
Oh, yeah.
If you remember Kant, there's this big thing that most philosophy students are taught. It's called the, am I really going to forget it just now?
Oh, Professor Weiner would be disappointed in you.
Oh my goodness. It's the three maxims.
Okay.
That's not the name. The categorical imperative.
Okay, there you go. You redeemed yourself.
I
Good
couldn't
job.
believe I just forgot that. But anyway.
It's okay, brain farts. They all happen. It's a live show.
Well, anyhow, Sartre says that, well, the categorical imperative tells us never to treat people merely as a means, but as an end unto themselves. There are two other rules, but not important to the example.
Okay.
But Sartre's thing is like, well, you will follow the categorical imperative no matter what you do in this student situation. You're not treating anyone as a means. The other two, you're making your own decision, your own sovereign decision. There's no violation here. So someone tell the student what to do. This, if he was speaking, this would be the point where all the students don't say anything.
Yeah, exactly, because just the weight of those two scenarios is just sitting in them, and they realize there is no concrete answer.
There's no objective answer.
No.
And so Sartre would say, you just have to choose. And you don't have a guide.
No, and we can't make that decision for you.
Nope.
Nope.
And that followed a theme in Kierkegaard's work. When it came to Kant, Kant said, well, the categorical imperative, God cannot violate the categorical imperative. It's an imperative. It's not that he can't, it's just that he wouldn't. It's an absolute moral rule. Right? And Kierkegaard would say, well, you know, you don't really have a good basis to decide between, you know, logic or religion. So if God shows up, you would think Kant would say, oh, well, and by the way, I'm taking this from a different lecture I've seen.
No worries.
God would, you would, if you're Kant, you would ask yourself if what you're seeing is actually God. By asking, does it follow the categorical imperative? Kierkegaard would say, it's God.
Well, yeah, Kierkegaard would say that.
Stop thinking.
Yeah.
It's too much thinking.
Yeah.
You're being too rational. And by the way, you don't have a great logical reason to choose reason or religion. So you're left to decide. You have no basis for your decision. Good luck.
So, do you think it is fair to say that the existentialist writers that you talked about would really, really, really hate Javert?
Oh, yeah. But for multiple reasons. First of all, he's an absolutist.
Yes.
He will not change his mind about anything. And this is a good transition to talk about what it means to be a human being for the existentialist.
Okay.
And we can keep contrasting Kant because he's very much a good example to bounce off of. So, what is a human being? What does it mean to exist in the world? Kant would say something like, existence doesn't add anything to the subject. And he gives the example of $100 in your mind is the same $100 in your hand. He doesn't say it like that, but that's basically the point.
You still get the gist.
People like Kierkegaard, and it starts with Kierkegaard, but I think insofar as I've read The Existentialist, this follows all the way through. I haven't seen an exception. They say that Kant's wrong. Once you exist, you're not like $100. The main difference between a human being and $100 or any kind of object is that the human being is never an is, in the sense that you can't say a human being is something. Existentialists.
Oh, I see now. Okay.
Existentialists would say human beings are always a becoming.
Something Javert fails to understand.
Right.
To disastrous consequences.
So, is a thief a thief?
Mm-hmm.
Can you go to a person and say, you are a thief?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you supposed to say, this person is becoming blank?
Yeah.
They are on their way towards... And, some people don't change.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what Javert fails to realize throughout the whole play is that people aren't just this one thing. There is always the capacity to change.
Yeah.
And this play is a perfect example of that.
Absolutely. And Javert has 3 moments in the musical where you learn the reason behind his thinking. The first moment is the confrontation he has with Jean Valjean, where Fantine dies and they square off. And so we don't just see a confrontation of rivals here, it's a confrontation of values. Because for Valjean, he sees it as his mission to help individuals who cross his path because one act of kindness can change their lives for the better, like with him. Even if they are sinful, they can be redeemed. And he's not going to let anyone like Javert get in the way because he has never forgotten how he was made to feel less than human. And he's not going to let anyone else go through that either. And for Javert, again, all black and white, no gray. He subscribes to the Old Testament belief of original sin, that because of the sins of Adam and Eve, humans inherited a tainted nature and are born naturally evil. So if you choose to be good, then you are good. If you choose to be evil, then you are evil through and through, and there is no hope for redemption. So Javert believes this especially because as he sings to Valjean, I was born inside a jail. I was born to scum like you. I come from the gutter too. So he worked to become an officer of the law, and as he says to Fantine, when she's on his knees begging to let her go so she can save her daughter, honest work, just reward, that's the way to please the Lord. And his idea of justice is condemning those who stray from the path. The second song is Stars, which, Aaron, I'm going to let you know about a cursed fun fact, okay?
Okay.
When someone asked Ben Shapiro what his stance was on stealing a piece of bread to feed your family as an ethical question during a live stream, he started singing this song, and there is footage of it on YouTube. Google at your own risk.
No, really?
Yes, it's not fake, and I wish it was.
Okay, well that's interesting.
Yep, says a lot about Shapiro, as if you didn't know already. Anyway, so, Stars reiterates Javert's beliefs, and that we've come to know over the course of the show, but it also serves as an I want song and an I am song. Javert sees himself as pious in service of the Lord, and because he sees himself that way, he wants to see Jean Valjean safe behind bars as punishment from running from God. And he holds that it must be this way, as it is written on the doorway into paradise. And you can see why Javert admires the stars the way he does, because they never veer off course. And it makes me think of an interview with Terrence Mann, who was the original actor to play Javert on Broadway, and he said it was the most challenging role to play because he didn't want to make him come off as just a bad guy, but someone driven by divine purpose, which is why most musical theater fans don't think of Javert as a villain in terms of the musical theater canon, just someone who's misinformed. And I was thinking of that word, and I thought, in history, there have been so many people who have become villains to society and to individuals due to their interpretations of religious beliefs, but they never see themselves that way. And religion aside, I was thinking, how many other misinformed people have used that defense? I was just following orders. I was just obeying the law. And that was why, like, well, maybe he's a little bit of a villain. Don't give him too much credit. Now, the last song with Javert. This is the one that
hold on. I want to stay on that train of thought, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So there's two things I want to say. There's a existentialist point of view, and there's also a life lesson kind of view.
Sure.
Life lesson is, does it really matter in the grand scheme of things, in the judgment of your actions, if you were well-intentioned?
Exactly.
I mean, isn't the point that be well-intentioned, that's cool.
But the road to hell is paved with them.
Sure, but imagine, like, someone hurts you, physically or otherwise. Now imagine someone comes to you and says, they meant well. I'm
still hurt.
Yeah, that doesn't make it okay.
No.
And I think when, you you ask morally, like, is this person to blame or what have you?
Mm-hmm.
No, well intentions aren't everything.
No.
You don't get to do whatever you want just because you meant well.
Yeah, and Javert's ruthlessness really, really cost Jean Valjean a lot.
So that's the other thing. Nietzsche, again, back to Nietzsche. Nietzsche somehow always seems relevant.
It's always back to Nietzsche. It's like 6 degrees of separation, but it's Nietzsche. Anyway.
So the point you made about how ruthless Javert is comes from that stance of I'm right, the Lord is on my side, there is no questioning this. And it's kind of back to this idea about absolute morality. And Nietzsche would say, yeah, not only are you wrong, but isn't it convenient how you come out on top?
Yes.
And
who are you really serving here?
Well, this was his critique of the culture of his time, which was falling actually in his time, but his big objection to Christianity. And we talked about this before, how you put a veil between the veil being your well intentions behind your hatred. And his evidence for this is the idea of hell. Because if all you have is good intentions, where did the idea of hell come from? Yeah. Right. So, and remember, Nietzsche is an atheist.
Oh, yes, very famously.
Right. But, interestingly, you brought this up earlier, but Nietzsche says the first person, I think he says, who redeemed himself in Nietzsche's sense was Christ.
Yeah.
But back to this idea of absolute morality, Nietzsche gives this example of the English. And
oh no. I'm sorry, if you know anything about English history, you're already like, where is this going?
So Nietzsche says the Englishmen would like utilitarianism to be the moral rule of the universe. And they make their decisions based on this. But isn't it funny how Britain turns out to be the one who spreads utilitarianism, and he accuses the real motivation of the British. It's not the utilitarianism you all love. You just love the British.
Yes, exactly.
And it doesn't go further than this.
No. Oh, man. So, just back to Javert really, really quickly.
Yeah.
Because this is where we see where absolutism, for him, fails epically. So it's when Valjean meets him in the sewers, and he's carrying Marius, and he says, he needs a doctor, I need to get him to safety. And, he's spared Javert's life already at this point, and Javert looks at him and goes, once a thief, always a thief. And he goes, Valjean, you want a deal? And Valjean said, no. And as he says to him earlier on in the musical, if you want to find me, here's where I am. I have to go because I have more important stuff to do. Now, this is where we see the flaw in Javert's thinking, because that he doesn't understand that humans, as you said, are in the process of becoming. He doesn't understand that they are fallible, unlike the God he worships. They make mistakes. They repent. He believes there's no room for repentance. You have to choose to be good, and you have to be as infallible as the God who made you 24/7, 365 days a year. And the idea that Valjean is capable of a good deed makes him snap. But what's also bad for Javert is that the person who he's trying to keep from freedom gave him freedom by letting him go. And because it's not the outcome he predicted in his brain, what happened in real life doesn't match the story he's been telling himself. And for reference, I found this amazing interview with Philip Quast, who's one of the most famous actors to play Javert of all time. Javert uses the word allow, which signals that he acknowledges Jean Valjean has power over him for sparing his life, especially with the word dominion, which is the only word that can't be used in the song due to Javert's fervor. And what happens is he asks 4 questions in a row about what comes next, what this act of mercy means for him, and he's not answered at all, which is when the cycle of desperation, prayer, and doubt kick off for this character at an accelerated speed. And Quast highlights the extreme antithesis of this song, which is perfect for Javert because he doesn't find a happy medium in anything. And this is why I think it's the most existential song, because this song can be summed up in one famous Shakespearean quotation.
Okay, give it to me.
To be or not to be.
Ah.
And there's more antithesis with his heart of stone trembling, the world he knows being lost in shadow. Is he from heaven or from hell? Another question. And in giving me my life, this man has killed me even so. I am reaching, but I fall. And then the climax is the stars are black and cold. The constant that Javert looked up to and relied on, and they are extinguished from the sky. And that is the moment where he settles on not to be and jumps off the bridge into the river. So that shows you where absolutism gets you. Rather extreme, but I said it. And
suicide. Okay.
No. Just a moment of desperation. Not suicide, but it's like you have to either do what Valjean did, where he came to a pivotal moment in his life and determined to make a change, or you are so clinging to your beliefs that you can't change and you break. Doesn't always end in suicide, but for Javert, it does, because he can't live in this world anymore.
There is something very interesting about Javert. I should say, there's a whole revolution going on while these two are having this drama.
Yep.
And let me talk about that for a minute.
Yeah,
too.
Let's definitely talk about that.
Because Javert, we can come back to Javert and Jean. But funny enough, existentialists were very influential, not in the time of the French Revolution, for somewhat obvious reasons.
Well, yeah.
But post-World War II, they became very influential, first of all, in French culture, because Sartre and de Beauvoir were French writers. And there are a lot of other periphery writers who were talking about them.
Oh, yeah.
But existentialism, specifically Sartrean existentialism, became very popular in the Arab world. Also in some places in Latin America.
Yes.
The reason it became so popular is because, first of all, of what Sartre and the other existentialists were saying, but also the culture behind it. The culture being, you are the one who makes the decisions moving forward. The hands of fate are now in the hands of humanity.
Yes.
Or I should say, not the hands of fate are the hands of humanity. And this becomes very apparent in one essay for Sartre, immediately after the war, when Sartre is talking about the new potentiality for human beings to destroy themselves with the atom bomb. And he says, now more than ever, human beings are the ones who get to decide whether we live or die.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that, because you see that most with the student revolutionaries, particularly with Enjolras in particular. And, you know, we first get the sense of revolution where we have the reprise of Look Down, and everyone is singing, something's gonna give, and then they go, it'll come, it'll come, it'll come, it'll come, to sound like a ticking clock, to say there's only so long before this can last. And as Enjolras says, with all the anger in the land, how long before the judgment day? Because he knows it's coming.
Right.
And then with Red and Black, it's interesting because that's when Marius comes in after having fallen in love with Cosette. And you find out that in the book, Marius is from a wealthy, privileged, monarchist family. You can see the reference in the movie. And in the book, it's when he meets Courfeyrac that he's introduced to his revolutionary friends. So as they're planning, when Enjolras looks at him and says, it's time for us all to decide who we are, have you asked yourself what's the price you may pay? Is this a game for rich young boys to play? It's a subtle dig at Marius' wealth and privilege, and it's calling into question his commitment to the cause. And then when Marius sings about his love for Cosette, you see he has the same passionate fervor for her. Well, maybe not the same passionate fervor, but he's using the same term to describe his love for her that the Republican students have for taking up arms against the monarchy. But as Enjolras reminds him, their lonely lives don't count at all as long as the people are suffering, and they must work to see this higher goal accomplished first, which they say beautifully in the anthem, "Do You Hear the People Sing," as they go on to fight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That relates to the afterward or to the decolonization efforts.
Yes.
That spring up over the colonized world. But I think it's 2017, there was a book written about Arab, existentialist influence in the Arab world, and how these ideas of freedom and freeing yourself really took off.
Yeah.
And one of the writers who is sometimes not considered an existentialist, but I think he is.
Okay.
Is Frantz Fanon.
Ah, yes.
If you've heard of him. Specifically because Fanon, and he had some communication with Sartre about this, Fanon was really interested in the psychology of people who were colonizers and colonized.
Yes.
And he looked at racial relations at his time, and he has this famous line which really fits into actually not just the wider Civil War, but the relationship between I just put together both their names at the same time.
Oh, it's okay. Take two.
Javert and Jean. All right.
Yeah, Javert and Jean Valjean.
Yeah. The famous line Fanon has is, "The racist creates his inferior." And the idea there is that, like we said, what is a person? A person isn't a thing in itself. A person is always in the state of becoming. So the idea becomes, well, if anyone is inferior to anyone else, it's because you, in your mind, you treat them as inferior.
Yes.
It's not that they actually are inferior. And any perceived differences is more, and this isn't an existentialist point, but
but yeah.
Plenty of people have pointed this out, but any differences between you, it's more of a, cultural / inherited difference.
Yeah.
But as there's a famous quip in some of Adam Smith's works, actually, is that he said, if you look across the world, you'll notice a number of differences between mankind. But if you look even closer, the differences are merely the conditions of birth, not the birth in itself.
Yeah, I agree with that.
He'll say something like that. I don't have the quotation in front of me.
The point still comes across.
Yeah, the point is there.
Yeah.
There was something else I wanted to talk about the play.
Okay.
I wanted your opinion, actually.
Yes, of course. What's up?
The whole relationship between Jean and the little girl.
Cosette?
Cosette.
Yes.
What? You have to refresh my memory. What exactly? Why did he take her? So
when Valjean becomes mayor, he owns a factory. One of the factory workers is Fantine. And what happens is she receives a letter saying that her daughter is ill. You need to send more money. There's no time to lose. So what happens is the workers get her kicked out. The foreman kicks her out, which leads to one of the most famous songs from Les Mis, "I Dreamed a Dream," which we can talk about later. But so Fantine, she's forced into a situation where she has to become a prostitute. And not only that, it might not come across that well in the concert, but she sells her hair and she sells her teeth. And so she's about to be arrested because she struck out against one of the men who pursued her, for lack of a better term. And Javert is about to arrest her, and she says, please, I need to, there's a child, she'll die if I don't give her the money. And Javert says, I have heard these stories every day. And he's like, save your breath, save your tears. So Valjean steps in, and he says, a moment of your time, Javert, I believe this woman's tale. And he goes, I've seen your face before, can I help you? And she goes, don't mock me. You saw what happened. Because at one point, Valjean comes in and says to the workers, ladies, settle down. He says to the foreman, you deal with this. And Fantine reaches out to him. She's like, please help me, please help me. He's like, I don't have time. I have to go. And she goes, you were there and you turned aside. And he's like, oh my God, this woman's suffering is because of me. So he says, okay, take her to the hospital. I will take your daughter and I will raise her in my care. So he gets Cosette from the innkeeper and his wife.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about.
The innkeeper or Cosette?
The whole situation.
Okay.
Because,
what do you want to know?
It's like, Jean just pulls up and says, hey, I want to buy your adopted daughter.
Shows how despicable the Thénardiers are, doesn't it? But you know what's also worse is that in the guise of this comedic number, Master of the House, which is a much-needed emotional respite from the intensity of the first act, you learn that Thénardier's only goal is to make profit through whatever means necessary. And while this seems fun, especially with Matt Lucas, you realize over the course of the song, because of what he and his scumbag wife reveal, Cosette wasn't really sick. They were just milking Fantine for money, and she died for nothing, and it makes your blood boil. And it's like, this guy's going to smile at you one minute and then knife you in the back the next. And so, yeah, especially when Valjean comes in and he's like, I found your kid wandering around in the woods. And then, they pretend to be concerned. And it's like, oh, you're going to take away our kid? And he's like, let's not haggle for Colette. And the wife's like, Cosette. And he's like, oh, yes, Cosette. That's what I meant. And they said, she's been ill. We need money to compensate for her medicine. And they ironically say, there's treacherous people about. Your intentions might not be honorable. And you look at them and you go, oh, screw you. Yes, he comes in and he's like, no more words. Fine. If you want money, here's $1,500. And he looks at them and he goes, thank you. It's not going to take you too long to forget about her, and whisks her away, which is ironic because they remember him a few scenes later. But anyway, what was some points that you wanted to bring up with that scene?
Well, no, I wanted to talk to you about it because it just struck me as funny that, like, and this, you said this is back in the 1700s, so I guess
1800s.
1800s. The point is, it's for whatever reason, it's not surprising. You can just roll up on a family and just say, $15,000 for your daughter? Okay, yeah. Apparently, that's a fine deal.
Trafficking? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it goes to show, like, the conditions under which everyone is living. Mm-hmm. And the innkeeper was an interesting character.
Yes.
With the whole master of the house situation. And then compare that to, I don't think it's the last song, but towards the end, where there's this kind of reprisal of the master of the house.
Oh, where they're at the wedding.
Yeah.
And he's like, he finds Marius's ring, and Marius knows that Valjean saved his life.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the tragedy being, of course, he survives through the whole war and everything.
He's the only one of his friends to not die.
Yeah.
Which, when you listen to Empty Chairs at Empty Tables, which I'll just talk about for a little bit before we circle back to Thénardier, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. This is the moment of the show where Marius has an existential crisis almost. And it's a common one for people who survive unimaginable tragedies such as genocide, terrorist attack, and massacres. Why, out of all his friends, he wants to know, is he the only one to survive, especially being a new member? And what twists the knife in even more for him is that for the slain revolutionaries, their goal never came to fruition, where Marius says, don't ask me what your sacrifice was for, making the pain even worse for Marius, where all he can do is mourn for his friends, which is just heartbreaking. Now, talking about that, I want to go back to the innkeeper for just one brief second, because His song, Dog Eats Dog, reminded me of Nietzsche for one obvious reason. So this is when Thénardier is pilfering corpses from the barricade in the sewers, like, gold teeth? You won't need that anymore. And we learn his philosophy. It's a world where the dog eats the dog, where they kill for bones in the street. And God in his heaven, he don't interfere, 'cause he's dead as the stiffs at my feet. So I was thinking, yeah, which is a nice little reference the composers made to Nietzsche. God is dead and we have killed him and the empty churches are his tomb. Even if it wasn't intentional. And I don't know if this is something that Thénardier said in the original novel to an extent, but it is an interesting statement considering the show's protagonists, for the most part, believe in a higher power, but because of the world Thénardier lives in, he very much doesn't.
Oh, you know what I just thought of? There is that interesting, if you compare and contrast Javert with the innkeeper, specifically that line where it's like one believes in God and divine right, and the other just sees God as dead. But they're both pretty repugnant.
Yes.
And it is interesting if I can go back to Nietzsche again.
Yeah, of course. Always back to Nietzsche.
So the context in which Nietzsche says God is dead and we have killed him comes about through a parable of the Madman, in which there's a madman.
Red leather, yellow leather.
Take two. Madman, and he goes into a bar full of atheists, and his basic thing is like, yeah, he's making a cultural statement, which is God is dead and we have killed him. With the advances in technology, the trying to understand the world, and the idea is there's a new culture around the corner. But the madman says at the end, he says, "You have all misunderstood. Now is not my time," and he walks away.
Ha ha!
And it's more of the parable. I think you could interpret it as. In much the same way that, you can view the revolution. It was a time that will be but has not yet come.
Yeah.
But to the broader point about contrasting the two characters, Javert and the innkeeper, you see, like, it doesn't seem to matter. Like, they're upfront statements of motivation. According to them, everyone is in it for themselves. There's no room for saying, oh, like, there's a wider and more important thing to fight for.
Yeah.
Even Javert, who might say, well, I'm fighting for God.
Are you?
Right. The question is, like, how is it then that, you become the arbiter?
Yes.
And for the innkeeper, it's a nice story. Don't get me wrong about God is dead, so there's no moral judgment here. I'm just taking what I can, like anyone else would.
By pilfering corpses.
By pilfering corpses, but also, like, it's sometimes people, I think it's a larger statement about human nature. Intentional or not, about, like, I shouldn't say human nature. Not all people are like this, but
yeah,
the things we say to ourselves to justify what we do.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you brought up the innkeeper and Javert, because I kind of want to talk about Bring Him Home briefly, and I think that'll be a good note to end on. There's a lot of songs in Les Mis because it's a sung-through show, so...
Yeah, it was a long musical.
It was a long musical. This episode's getting a little bit long, so I want to wrap it up quickly with these two most important thoughts. So to everyone's like, oh, we're not going to talk about Fantine or Eponine or Cosette.
I honestly did not find them very interesting.
Well, I will say that they're two songs, I Dreamed a Dream and On My Own. I kind of find them mirroring each other in a way because they... imagine a life of love and happiness, and without this love in their life, the world is a dark and lonely place, and they still cling to hope. Cosette, I just find her interesting because when she falls in love with Marius, she questions why she's falling in love with someone else. But if you look at it, it's like You're the daughter of a former convict who's always on the run. So many things in your life are uncertain, but if you know for certain that you love this man, the one certain thing in your life, of course you're going to go after him. So that's all I have to say about those characters. So I'm just going to talk about Bring Him Home really quick and then the end of the show. So, in terms of Valjean and God, he never really asks God for anything for most of the show. He doesn't do anything for himself, really. He does things for other people. His I Want song in the musical is Bring Him Home when all the revolutionaries are asleep. And when it's sung, it has the tenderness of a lullaby and is sung in falsetto to emphasize the purity of this request and to give the song a heavenly tone. But for an I Want song, he doesn't want anything for himself. Instead, he asks God to keep Marius alive out of love for Cosette so the two of them can be happy. And then, with the finale, the reprise of Do You Hear the People Sing, which is the emotional catharsis the audience needs, because the musical, for once, ends in... There's an uplifting note where Valjean ascends into heaven with Fantine and Eponine. It's an appropriate ending because he fulfills his promise to the bishop by being honest to the person who needed it the most with his last confession, Cosette, where he writes the letter and tells her everything she's ever wanted to know. And now that his loved ones know the truth, his good deeds are accomplished, and he's at peace with his life, he can finally rest. And there's nowhere else for the show to go. And now he lives in freedom and he's at peace. And as they say, tomorrow comes, and when it's arrived, it's a beautiful morning. Yeah.
That is a good point to end on.
Yeah. Let's conclude it there.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for listening to our second episode of Where's the Director? Aaron, thank you so much for coming over to record episode 2.
It's my pleasure, although I thought it was the third.
Well, our mini episode. We did our mini episode,
right.
our episode 0 for Introduction to Existentialism. So yes, this is our third video, but our second official episode.
Gotcha.
But we will be working on a third one that will come out at some point, but I already have a musical in mind, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Okay, so again, thank you for listening to the second episode. Aaron, again, thank you for coming over. I always have fun when we record together. It's a good time. And fellow listeners, thank you for listening. As always, we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye. Oh, at the same time.